In the annals of history, some events are so vast, so universally accepted, that they escape scrutiny. They become part of the landscape, like mountains we no longer see. The story of the 19th-century asylum is one such event. We are shown images of colossal, Gothic structures, rising from the countryside like forgotten palaces. We are told they were hospitals, built out of a sudden, compassionate awakening to the plight of the mentally ill. It is a simple, clean narrative. It is also a narrative that collapses under the slightest pressure. Between roughly 1850 and 1890, humanity embarked on one of the most expensive, coordinated, and architecturally ambitious construction projects in its history. Hundreds of these immense facilities were erected across the Western world, from the hills of Massachusetts to the plains of Australia. They were built with a speed and on a scale that defied the technological limits of the age. The official story asks us to believe that dozens of independent governments, all at once, decided to bankrupt their treasuries to build ornate palaces for society's most marginalized people. It asks us to believe in a pandemic of insanity that is not recorded in any other historical data. Tonight, we do not present a theory. We present the evidence, the blueprints, the financial ledgers, the demographic data. We will demonstrate that the official narrative is not just flawed, it is a mathematical and logistical impossibility. And we will ask a question that history has been careful to avoid. If these buildings were not truly for the insane, what were they for? Before we examine the numbers, we must first examine the objects themselves. The physical evidence left behind. What were these buildings? The common term is asylum, but to look upon them is to see something else. They were not designed like hospitals. They were designed like monuments. Take the so-called Kirkbride plan, the architectural template used for hundreds of these sites. It called for a central administration building, flanked by tiered, receding wings, often in a shallow V or batwing shape. This was presented as a design for therapy, allowing for air and light. But look closer. The central building is almost always a statement of power. It features imposing clock towers, ornate cupolas, grand entrances, and dramatic spires that rivaled the cathedrals of the era. The materials were not cheap. They were the most expensive available. Vast quantities of red brick laid in intricate patterns, slate roofs that would last for centuries, and carved stone features that required immense artisanal skill. Why? Why this incredible expense and ornamentation for facilities meant to house people who, according to the records of the day, were often kept in squalid conditions? The logic is inverted. A society that neglects its charges does not simultaneously build them palaces. Compare these structures to other public works of the time. A typical 19th-century general hospital was a far more modest, functional building. A school was a simple brick box. But the asylums, they dwarfed everything. The Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts sat on a commanding hilltop, its Gothic towers visible for miles. The Colney Hatch Asylum in London had a facade a third of a mile long, one of the longest buildings in Europe. These were not just buildings, they were declarations. They were also fortresses. They were almost universally designed as self-contained, self-sufficient compounds. They had their own power plants, their own farms and livestock, their own workshops, bakeries, and reservoirs. They were isolated from the surrounding communities, often by miles of empty land and imposing walls. This design speaks not of integration and healing, but of isolation and containment on an industrial scale. The architecture is a riddle. The opulence does not match the stated occupants. The scale does not match the stated purpose. The fortress-like nature does not match the stated mission of care. It is the first and most obvious clue that we are not being told the whole story. We are looking at a solution, but we have been given the wrong problem. The visual anomaly is unsettling. The logistical analysis, however, is damning. The construction of the global asylum network in the 19th century represents a feat of engineering and resource allocation that borders on the impossible for its time. Let us consider the process, step by step. First, the materials. A single large asylum, like the Hudson River State Hospital, required tens of millions of bricks. In the mid-1800s, bricks were made by hand, fired in small local kilns. The sheer quantity required would have exhausted the production capacity of entire regions for years. Where did they come from? The historical record is often silent on this, speaking only of local brickyards that could not possibly have met the demand. Then, transport. These materials, millions of bricks, Tons of quarried stone, thousands of acres of timber, had to be moved. The primary method of transport was the horse and cart. Railways were new and their networks were sparse. Many asylums were built in remote locations, up steep hills, far from any rail line. Imagine the scene. An endless caravan of wagons, day after day, for years, struggling over primitive roads to deliver the components of a small city to a vacant hilltop. The cost of this transport alone would have been astronomical. Who paid for it, and how was it organized? Now consider the labor. These were not simple structures. The intricate brickwork, the complex slate roofing, the stone carving, this required thousands of highly skilled artisans, not just common laborers. Where did this massive, mobile workforce come from? How were they recruited, transported, housed, and fed at these remote construction sites, often for 5 to 10 years at a time? There are no records of the vast tent cities or barracks that would have been necessary. The construction timelines themselves are perhaps the most unbelievable element. The Buffalo State Asylum, a colossal sandstone edifice, was built in just a few years. In an age of hand tools, animal power, and rudimentary machinery, the speed of this global project is inexplicable. We struggle to build a simple skyscraper in 5 years with modern power tools and computerized logistics. Yet we are told that hundreds of far more complex structures were raised simultaneously across the world with nothing more than steam shovels and human muscle. The capital required is the final piece of this impossible puzzle. State governments in the 1860s and 70s had modest budgets, primarily consumed by basic infrastructure and administration. Yet, suddenly, they found the funds to engage in the most expensive building projects they would ever undertake. Often, the cost of a single asylum would equal the state's entire annual budget. Where did this sudden, universal flood of money originate? It appeared in America, in Britain, in Canada, in Australia, all at the same time, all earmarked for the same purpose. The official story simply states that legislatures approved the funds. But this is not an explanation. It is an evasion. The project's logistics do not compute. The material sourcing, the transportation, the labor, the speed, and the funding all contradict the known capabilities of the 19th century. To accept the official story is to accept a miracle of construction that has no parallel in history. When the physical evidence and logistical data defy explanation, we must turn to the official narrative itself. Here, we find not clarity, but a carefully constructed story that is vague, repetitive, and emotionally persuasive. The story goes like this: the Industrial Revolution created new social stresses, leading to a massive and sudden increase in mental illness. A group of enlightened reformers, like Dorothea Dix and Dr. Thomas Kirkbride in America, championed a new philosophy of moral treatment. They argued that the insane could be cured if removed from society and placed in a peaceful, beautiful environment. Moved by their arguments, governments everywhere opened their coffers to build these therapeutic palaces. It is a story of progress and compassion, but it is filled with holes. First, the sudden crisis in mental health is not supported by broad demographic data. What is documented is not an explosion of illness, but an explosion in diagnoses. The definitions of insanity were expanded to include conditions like melancholia, hysteria, insubordination, and even novel reading for women. The net was cast wider and wider, providing a steady stream of occupants for the ever-expanding facilities. Was this a genuine health crisis, or the creation of a problem to fit a pre-existing solution? The buildings came first, the mass diagnoses followed. Second, the official records are profoundly unsatisfying. When you search for the construction records of these asylums, you find very little. Budgets are approved, but the detailed ledgers of where the money went are often missing. The minutes of the legislative debates are brief and lacking in substance. The justification is repeated like a mantra: for the care of the indigent insane. It feels less like a debate and more like the rubber stamping of a decision already made. The language is identical, from state to state, country to country. It's a template. The proponents of the plan, like Kirkbride, are presented as heroic figures. But his rise to prominence was astonishingly fast. His book, On the Construction of Hospitals for the Insane, became an instant, international blueprint. Was he a lone genius whose ideas were so compelling they were instantly adopted by the entire world? Or was he the spokesman for a much larger, better organized agenda? The greatest failure of the official story is the outcome. These palaces of moral treatment did not become centers of healing. Within a decade of opening, almost all of them had descended into nightmarish warehouses of human misery, notorious for overcrowding, abuse, and neglect. If the goal was compassion, the project was a catastrophic failure on a global scale. But what if compassion was never the goal? What if the buildings performed their true function perfectly? The story of humanitarianism explains the marketing. It does not explain the architecture, the cost, or the logistics. It is a cover story, and a thin one at that. If this were the story of one or two unusual buildings in one country, it could be dismissed as an anomaly. An obsession of a particular governor, perhaps. But it is not. The Asylum project was a global, synchronized event. This is the piece of evidence that elevates the mystery from a local curiosity to a historical paradigm. Let's look at a map. In the United States, a wave of construction begins in the 1850s. New York builds Hudson River and Buffalo. Massachusetts builds Danvers, Worcester, and Northampton. Ohio builds Athens, Dayton, and Columbus. The list goes on, a new monumental asylum for nearly every state. At the exact same time, across the Atlantic, the United Kingdom is engaged in the same frenzy. Colney Hatch and Hanwell in London, High Royds in Yorkshire. These are not just hospitals, they are sprawling brick cities. Travel across the globe to Australia, a young colony with a tiny population. Yet there they are again. The Kew Asylum in Melbourne, the Callan Park Hospital in Sydney. Vast, ornate structures that would have strained the resources of a mature European state, let alone a fledgling colonial outpost. The pattern is too perfect. The timing is too coincidental. Communication in the 19th century was slow. An idea born in Philadelphia would take years to be debated, funded, and implemented in London, let alone in Melbourne. Yet this complex architectural and social plan was executed almost simultaneously across vast distances, across different cultures and forms of government. It suggests not a slow diffusion of an idea, but the execution of a pre-existing, centrally distributed plan. The architectural language is also a global constant. The red brick, the slate roofs, the towering central administration block, the bat wing layout. An asylum in rural Georgia, USA, looks uncannily like one in rural Victoria, Australia. They share a design DNA that is too specific to be coincidence. It's as if they all ordered from the same catalog. This was not an architectural style that evolved, it was an architectural model that was deployed. We must consider the context of other global projects of the era. The expansion of the railways, the laying of transatlantic telegraph cables. These were celebrated as triumphs of industry and international cooperation, driven by clear economic motives. The asylum network was built on a similar scale, with similar coordination, but its driving motive remains opaque. Its construction is presented as a series of disconnected, local humanitarian acts. But the evidence on the ground, the buildings themselves, tell a different story. They tell of a single, unified project, executed on a global scale, by a guiding hand that we cannot see in the official records. Are we looking at 100 different stories, or one story with 100 different locations? The story, the architecture, and the logistics all feel wrong? But feelings can be deceptive. Numbers are not. When we apply simple mathematics to the asylum network, the official narrative does not just fray, it disintegrates. Let's perform a simple analysis. Consider the state of Ohio. In 1870, its population was roughly 2.6 million people. In that decade, the state was operating several massive asylums, including the Athens Lunatic Asylum, designed for over 500 patients, and the Columbus Asylum, designed for over 900. These were just two of many. To justify even one of these facilities, let alone a statewide network, would require a significant percentage of the population to be diagnosed with severe, institutional-grade insanity. The numbers required are far higher than any credible historical estimate of mental illness. The math suggests not a response to a crisis, but the creation of capacity far in excess of any documented need. This excess capacity was then, predictably, filled by broadening the definition of who needed to be locked away. Now, let's analyze the cost from a different perspective. Cost per bed. In the 1870s, a bed in a state-of-the-art general hospital cost a certain amount to build. A dormitory bed at a new university cost even less. The cost per bed in a Kirkbride asylum, however, was often 5 to 10 times higher. Why? The official reason is the therapeutic environment, the high ceilings, the wide corridors. But this cannot account for such a vast disparity. The money was not being spent on medical equipment. It was being spent on non-functional ornamentation, Gothic towers, carved stonework, and sheer, unnecessary scale. You are not just building a bed, you are building a monumental statement. It's the economics of building a palace, not a hospital. The material volume provides another path for logical analysis. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia is said to contain 9 million bricks. Let us be conservative and assume a 19th-century bricklayer could lay 400 bricks a day. To lay 9 million bricks would require over 22,000 man-days of skilled labor. This is just one trade, for one part of one building. Add in the stone masons, the carpenters, the roofers, the plasterers. The labor requirement for a single site is equivalent to a small army. Now multiply that by the hundreds of sites being built at the same time. The numbers suggest a mobilization of labor that rivals a major war, yet it has been relegated to a footnote in our history books. The logic fails at every level. The patient numbers don't justify the capacity. The cost per bed doesn't justify the function. The material and labor numbers don't justify the timeline. The asylum network is a mathematical anomaly. It represents a massive misallocation of capital and resources without parallel. Unless, of course, the resources were not misallocated at all. Unless they were spent on a project whose true purpose required exactly this scale, exactly this cost, and exactly this architecture. We are left with a collection of facts that cannot be reconciled with the accepted history. An immense, globally coordinated construction project of ornate, fortress-like buildings, completed with impossible speed and expense, for a purpose that does not stand up to mathematical scrutiny. It is not enough to simply point out the inconsistencies. We must attempt to form a hypothesis that fits the evidence. This is not a claim of truth. It is a logical exercise. What kind of project requires these specific parameters? First, the buildings were built for containment, not care. The architecture speaks of control. The high walls, the isolated locations, the layouts designed for observation. Second, they were built for a massive number of people, far more than the genuinely insane. The scale was proactive, not reactive. Third, the project was centrally planned and globally executed, suggesting a powerful, coordinated group whose agenda superseded national governments. Fourth, the true purpose had to be concealed behind a plausible, humanitarian facade. The story of moral treatment was the perfect cover. So, what function fits this framework? These were not hospitals. They were processing centers. They were infrastructure, built in advance of a coming event. We can speculate on the nature of that event. Perhaps they were intended as quarantine centers for a pandemic that was feared but never arrived. This would explain the need for isolation and self-sufficiency. Perhaps they were intended as barracks or dormitories for a planned mass migration of workers, a population that needed to be housed and controlled as they were funneled toward new industrial centers. This would explain the grand scale and proximity to developing transport hubs. A more unsettling hypothesis is that they were built as sorting facilities. Places to house, categorize, and re-educate large segments of the population deemed unfit for a new, emerging social order. The elastic definition of insanity would have been the tool used to select these people. The asylums were the machinery of a great social engineering project, the true nature of which has been scrubbed from the record. The palatial exterior served a dual purpose: to sell the project to the public as a grand civic work, and to demoralize and intimidate those destined to be its inmates. It was a statement of overwhelming power. This hypothesis does not require us to believe in lost technologies or secret societies. It only requires us to believe in what history has shown us time and again: that ruling classes engage in massive projects to solidify their control, and that they often hide their true intentions behind a veil of public benevolence. The asylum network was infrastructure. Its stated purpose was a lie. Its true purpose was related to the mass processing and control of human beings. The story of the 19th-century asylum network is a paradox. It is a story of magnificent buildings and profound human suffering. A story of supposed compassion and undeniable control. The evidence we have examined tonight does not provide a final answer. It is not meant to. It is meant to illuminate a question that has remained in the shadows for over a century. The numbers do not add up. The timeline does not make sense. The global synchronicity defies coincidence. The official narrative of a sudden humanitarian awakening fails the most basic tests of logic and evidence. We are left with the structures themselves. Hundreds of them, still standing. Many are in ruins, their ornate halls crumbling to dust. Others have been converted into luxury apartments or university campuses, their original purpose glossed over, their imposing architecture now a curious historical quirk. But they are not quirks. They are monuments to a vast, coordinated effort whose true purpose has been lost or, more likely, deliberately obscured. They are a loose thread in the tapestry of our history. If you pull on it, the entire fabric begins to unravel. We do not ask you to believe our hypothesis. We ask you to look at the evidence for yourself. Find the old asylum in your region. Stand before it. Observe its scale, its grandeur, its fortress-like presence. And ask yourself the simple question: does the story I was told make sense? The past is not a static, settled thing. It is a story, and stories can be rewritten. The truth is often not found in the books we are given, but in the anomalies we are taught to ignore. If you believe that our shared history is worth a deeper, more critical investigation, consider following our work. The archive is deep, and the questions are waiting.